I don't remember exactly when I got into left politics, but I used to be really conservative, so something changed at some point. It was definitely a slow burn, but in retrospect, a lot of it burnt over COVID. I feel like COVID forced a lot of people to realize a lot of things that previously felt impossible. Combine that with 4 years of Trump and police officers constantly murdering people, and you have a lot of frustrated college students suddenly realizing that there might be something fundamentally wrong with our society. And some of us turn to leftism, which is unlike other politics because for a lot of people, leftism involves reading a shit ton of books. I want to get this out of the way right now. You do not need to read theory to be a leftist or even a good leftist. If you don't want to read, that's fine. Go watch a YouTube video or just talk to people. If you think other people need to read theory, you are not a good leftist. The whole goal behind left politics is popular revolution. If you insist that that's only going to happen if everyone reads your favorite book, you're setting yourself up for failure. People don't like being given homework. However, some people are genuinely interested in diving deeper into theory but don't know where to start. When I was getting into this, the first proper theory book I remember reading was Sublime Objective Ideology. I'll be honest, I don't really know what that book is about. On a similar note, I probably shouldn't have read Nietzsche when I was 14. There's just a lot of context that would have been really helpful and easier to follow for a beginner. But it's difficult to get context if you don't know where you should be looking. Anyways, I have a lot of context now. It's been a while since COVID and I read books sometimes, so I want to talk about some of them. This is a list of some of my favorite books that I think are good for beginner leftists. These aren't the most important books you can read, they're not the be-all, end-all, but they're all relatively short, they're all relatively easy to understand, and they're all very engaging in my opinion. You don't have to read all of them, but I mean, you can if you want to. And if you do, I think you'll have a very good idea of where I'm coming from and a good idea of the leftist tradition. It is tilted in the more anarchist libertarian direction, but I mean, I'm not going to apologize for being right. On to the list. Why Socialism by Albert Einstein. I have a background in physics, so whenever I see STEM subjects overlapping with philosophy or left politics subjects, I feel personally obligated to investigate it since it's sort of on the boundary that I occupy. That is to say, I went into this expecting it to be an interesting historical footnote and not much else. That is not what this is. Why Socialism is the best introduction to left politics for anyone, hands down, period. It's short, it's engaging, it hits all the right points, it's way deeper than it needs to be while still being very accessible. Einstein was awesome for like 40 completely different reasons. If you only read one thing on this list, I strongly recommend you read this. It's also the shortest piece on this list. It's only like 10 pages or so. You can read it in an afternoon. While I was reading it, I had the sudden realization that Einstein was probably in and around Germany during the German Revolution. It's also fun for me as a STEM student to find out that I'm participating in a tradition of scientists being political radicals. So that's a plus. The Principles of Communism by Friedrich Engels. This is an FAQ. He was like, this is probably going to be confusing for them. So he wrote an FAQ for you. And it's great. You don't have to read the entire thing, although you should. If you want, you can just go to the specific questions and read parts you'd like more clarification on. The Principles of Communism was also originally written as an early version of the Communist Manifesto, and you can see similarities between it and the actual manifesto. Ultimately, the manifesto works better as a manifesto, but the Principles of Communism is certainly clearer, and because of its clarity, a lot of people advise that this should be your first encounter with Marx and Engels. The Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto is problematic. It's great, but it was written for a specific time and place. And in some ways, it can be confusing to a modern audience. The people it was written for were like factory workers in the midst of the Industrial Revolution at the very early stages of capitalism. It wasn't uncommon for you to get your arm ripped off by a machine in the freak accident at your 15-hour shift, where you wouldn't even get minimum wage. So there was a kind of general frustration amongst people, which would become so aggravated as to develop into revolutionary tendencies. The manifesto, in many ways, gave words to this general frustration. Today, though, capitalism is much better at optics, and most people have accepted the system, so we aren't operating with the same presuppositions workers in the 19th century would have had. Still, though, the Communist Manifesto is the most popular and widely read text Marx and Engels ever wrote, and I think you'll be fine as long as you keep the historical context in mind. They start by explaining their theory of history, then critique the current system, then conclude by predicting the future and enumerating 10 policies that they predict may occur during the transition out of capitalism. It's really radical and really exciting to read and reread. The Principles of Communism might be good for clarification, but reading the manifesto makes you feel like a revolutionary. Capital. Don't click off the video. I know Capital is a 3-volume, 3,000-page monstrosity, and I'm not saying to read it all. But The first part of the first book is only like 100 pages or 3 chapters, and it's worth checking out. Marx begins Capital by explaining his theory of value, how it develops dialectically, how it manifests in the commodity, in detail for the first 200 pages or so. After that, the rest of Capital is him using that idea to analyze his society. But you gain so much by just reading the first part. I don't think it's an accident that he begins like this, because in my opinion, basically the whole theory stems from this. If you're just put off by book thickness, there's another book where he basically discusses the same thing called Wage, Labor, and Capital. Wage, Labor, and Capital is a pamphlet like the Manifesto, and I've read it, but I honestly think he spelt it out much better in the first part of Capital, which is why I'm recommending it. You could also just watch a YouTube video on the labor theory of value, and plenty exist, and they're excellent, and you should. But the first part of Capital is also interesting as a concrete example of dialectical reasoning. Dialectics is a big part of left politics. More on that later in the video. It's kind of what sets Marx apart from other socialist thinkers of his time. For example, I really like Peter Kropotkin, who writes a lot of the same stuff that Marx writes, but reading Kropotkin is kind of like reading a blog. Like, I agree with it, but when you read Marx, it's clear he's doing something else in the background. Anarcho-Syndicalism, Theory and Practice by Rudolf Rocker. Anarcho-syndicalism is not a perfect theory. I think the anarchist Malatesta had some very effective critiques of it, but I wanted to have at least one anarchist tract on here because a lot of people think left politics must be essentially Leninist in nature, which is not the case. Anarcho-syndicalism is basically the idea that we should all unionize, and the unions should federate with each other and get so powerful that they can overthrow their local governments and institute worker syndicates, which would be self-governed. It's a fascinating idea, and it used to be a major political ideology. The most famous example is probably the Spanish Civil War, which was fought mainly between Franco's fascist regime and various anarchist and other leftist factions, such as the FAI, POUM, and most famously the CNT. Anarcho-syndicalism is also a good example of how we might do the revolution, and what a post-capitalist society might look like. A lot of what Marx wrote is critique of our current society, and he doesn't actually say much about what the next society will look like. This book is, in my opinion, one possible future and the method for how to get there. Or Fascism by Umberto Eco. What are we fighting against? Capitalism. Why are we fighting against capitalism? Well, a lot of reasons, but a big one is that, left untreated, capitalism has a tendency to develop into fascism. Well, what is fascism? That turns out to be a surprisingly difficult question to answer, mainly because fascism is incoherent. Of course, this doesn't bother the fascist, but it presents a difficulty for people like us trying to understand it. Enter Umberto Eco, who grew up under Mussolini's regime, and noticed that you really can't put these people into a box. They're all so different, yet so similar. Taking inspiration from the later Wittgenstein, instead of listing a set of exact criterion for what constitutes fascism, Eco enumerates a set of tendencies fascists tend to pick from. Any one of these tendencies is enough for fascism to fester around. Thus, two fascists can hold two completely different tendencies and nonetheless be correctly called fascists. I really like Fascism. It's very readable and short, and it's good to know your enemy. Capitalist Realism by Mark Fisher. Capitalist realism is a modern classic at this point. Fisher analyzes our society's inability to move beyond itself. He takes a lot of notes from postmodernists and Frankfurt School types, but makes them accessible to people without a background in theory. He also coins the term capitalist realism to characterize our society because postmodernism for him is too broad. In the same way that the Communist Manifesto was written for its time, capitalist realism really is a product of our time. It's very personal, it's very relatable, it's very easy to read. He makes a lot of references to pop culture like WALL-E and movies like Blade Runner. Also, a lot of what he writes about is mental health under capitalism and our inability to view mental health as a social ill, but as an individual problem. There's a lot to learn, and I think people like this book because when it hits really hard, and is one of my favorites on the list. Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord. People will get mad at me for putting this on an intro list, but I think it's a good direction. Society of the Spectacle is another analysis of our contemporary society, and it's often thought of as really presciently describing our time because it almost seems like it's describing Instagram, and Debord was critiquing social media before social media existed, which is fascinating for a number of reasons. There are a lot of older people who say things like technology is ruining society or phones are bad for us, etc. You know what I'm talking about. But Debord predicted a lot of these issues before these the internet or cell phones even existed, which makes me think that technology isn't the problem, but rather this mode of technology under capitalism. Society of the Spectacle is about the later phase of capitalism where images have become more central than reality. It's a difficult book, but it's short and really, really interesting. It's also the sort of book that you can read and enjoy without needing to fully understand it. It's definitely one of my favorites, and you should check it out if you're interested. The Soul of Man Under Socialism by Oscar Wilde. There is this idea that communism is collectivist and capitalism is individualist, and it's really, really reductionist. There are even many socialists who believe this, but part of the reason why I'm a socialist is because capitalism is not conducive to the full development of individualism. In fact, capitalism fosters conformity. And it's a conformity that is so deeply ingrained that we don't recognize it as conformity, but rather as a kind of individualism. Really, the kind of individualism pushed on us under capitalism is far more interested in preventing us from organizing with each other than in anything creative we might do as individuals. But even so, most people don't see socialism as a force for individuality. However, for Oscar Wilde, this is the main appeal of socialism. Because under socialism, individuals would be freed from the restraints preventing them from developing themselves. After bosses and markets, people would be free to operate without authority and in a way that pleases them and them alone. It's a very beautiful book and very important in my opinion. Socialism isn't about state control or conformity or welfare. Rather, socialism is the next phase in human freedom. On a related note, people like to contrast Marx with Nietzsche, where Nietzsche is the great individualist and Marx the great collectivist. But Nietzsche never wrote anything to support capitalism, and how am I supposed to become the Übermensch in conditions like these?
How am I supposed to eat this pizza without my drink?
Wouldn't it be the most Nietzschean task to destroy the existing society to make way for the Übermensch? What else could overcoming mean except overcoming the current society? What would it mean except revolution? On Contradiction by Mao. I think I've let my libertarian leanings show more than once in this video, so it shouldn't surprise anyone that I don't really like Mao. But Mao has the distinction of being one of the best writers in the Marxist tradition. He also wrote On Contradiction, which is useful for understanding much of the philosophy underlying leftism. On Contradiction is about contradictions, unsurprisingly. Why should we care about contradictions? Well, Mao was a student of Lenin, who was a student of Marx, who was a student of Hegel. Hegelian philosophy runs through basically all leftism. So what was Hegel about? You know how some Buddhists say that a box is only a box because it has an inside and an outside? Therefore, in some sense, the entire universe is the box? Hegel is kind of like that, times 1,000. He's the philosopher of negation and processes. For Hegel, the world is better understood not as concrete objects, but as a set of interconnected contradictions, like the box. This translates into politics because we can understand society as being based on contradictions which will eventually give way and lead to revolution. Hegel is also regarded as the most difficult philosopher in the Western canon. His books are basically incomprehensible, but On Contradiction aims to explain basic Hegelian philosophy to Chinese soldiers who have no formal training in leftist philosophy. It's extremely accessible. If you're interested in Marxist metaphysics or Hegel, or even in German idealism, this would be a good place to start. Spinoza. Spinoza is more of a philosopher than a leftist, although he was definitely a political radical for his time. His philosophy inspired, and therefore runs through, a ton of very important people who came after him. Marx read him, Deleuze wrote whole books on him, Nietzsche said Spinoza was his precursor, Bertrand Russell wrote that Spinoza was the most lovable and the most noble of the great philosophers, and no less an authority than Hegel said that it's either Spinoza or no philosophy at all. He's difficult to get into, but not nearly as difficult as someone like Hegel. And he is truly brilliant. Spinoza for me was a kind of stepping stone. He really is one of those thinkers who changes your whole outlook on everything. In a blog post, Mark Fisher had this to say: Spinoza changes everything, but gradually. There's no road to Damascus conversion to Spinozism, only a steady but implicable deletion of default assumptions. As with all the best philosophy, Spinoza is like running a Videodrome cassette. You think you're playing it, but it ends up playing you, effecting a gradual mutation of the way you think and perceive. In the first part of his most important work, Ethics, he builds on and criticizes Descartes, who had previously posited what has become known as Cartesian dualism. That is the idea that there's basically two kinds of substances, physical objects and soul stuff. Spinoza was one of the first to prove the absurdity of this position. In doing so, he arrives at other positions which initially appear far more ridiculous, but his reasoning is so airtight it's hard to find anything wrong with it, which is why he's held up so well. Reading Spinoza really feels weird at times because it's entirely coherent coherent, yet so foreign to how you normally view the world. I can't describe it, just go and read it. These are not the only books you should read, nor can they objectively be classified as the best introductory books. There is no canon to guide you, and assuming that there is one is a profound error. But these are some of my favorite books, and I hope that you'll find them as useful as I have. Anyways, please like and subscribe, and I hope you have a great day. Thank you.